Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're a little bit over time, but I want to make sure people have a chance to trickle in with traffic and a beautiful sunset, finally. So I'd like to welcome you. My name is John Alquist. I am a faculty member over at UCSD's School of Global Policy and Strategy. And we're thrilled to welcome you here tonight in collaboration with Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, also at UCSD, for one of the events in our ongoing series this year called San Diego 2049. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that is, and then I'm going to introduce our guests for the evening and then turn it over to them with no further ado. So San Diego 2049 is a program we're running this year. It's, again, global policy and strategy, collaborating with the Arthur C. Clarke Center to try to bring together lead forward-looking thinkers in the speculative fiction and futurism and world-building worlds, together with people who are thinking and doing serious research in political science, economics, and public policy. And part of this is in conjunction with the 30th anniversary of GPS. So we're celebrating our 30 years here. We're really good about thinking about the past and celebrating the past, but the way we want to do it is to try to think rigorously and consistently about the future and where we might be going. And so our plan for the year is to have a series of events that try to think rigorously about what we can do in the future to help solve all the problems that we see coming before us. So tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Glen Weyl. Glen has written, along with Eric Posner, a great recent book that I commend to you called Radical Markets. Glen is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, as well as a visitor at Princeton this year and a trained economist, among other things. And he'll be talking to us about radical economies. He's going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then we have a series of great interlocutors. We have my colleague, Renee Bowen, who is an economist and game theorist at GPS along with me, and who studies ways in which groups can get together to provide collective goods, to study international trade, among a variety of other things. And then we're also pleased to welcome a longstanding supporter of the Arthur C. Clarke Center and a UCSD alum, David Brin. David Brin is a very well-known essayist, novelist, both fiction writer and a nonfiction writer. He's won a variety of awards in science fiction, including the Hugo and the Nebula. He's also written The Transparent Society, which won the Freedom of Speech Award. And so we're pleased to have a diverse group of people to react and engage with some of Glen's ideas. So we're going to give each of them about 5 to 10 minutes to summarize their reactions and provide some kind of critical and provocative feedback. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So get out your pens and paper, make your notes, and you'll have a chance, hopefully, to interact with the speakers as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Glen.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And thanks to everyone, especially Renee and David, for participating. I have to say, it's really exciting to me to be here. This sort of an event is sort of a dream event for me. As you'll see, precisely what I've been doing really since the book came out is trying to unite precisely artists, academics, activists, to really have a much broader and more democratic and more effectual conversation about how we can address some of the big picture problems in our society. So this center is really precisely in the sweet spot of the sorts of things that I'm into these days. John mentioned a book that I wrote, and that book will show up in what I'm going to talk about. But for reasons that will become clear, things have evolved quite a bit from the book in terms of my thinking. And so what I'm going to talk about incorporates elements of the book, but it's quite different in presentation from the book. So what I've really been trying to do is think about some of the fundamental issues with what I would call liberalism. So liberalism is a very disputed term. I'll give you what I mean by it, which is sort of a broad political attitude, maybe kind of one of the most deep and persistent political attitudes in the broad West developed world since the Enlightenment. And it's an attitude of opposition to hierarchical, historically derived, concentrated authority. Some might call it decentralization. Some might call it sort of neutrality among different ways in which people live their lives. Some might call it an orientation towards markets or other sort of formal decentralized institutions. Another way you could describe it is the notion that while we're all equal, we're also all different, and that we should try to sort of benefit from the differences among us. So on the one hand, this is something that I think many of us have sort of a deep commitment to. But on the other hand, many of the institutions that we've put in place formally that try to instantiate this notion have been, I think, disappointing in various ways. And maybe we've been surprised by how disappointing they've been at various moments. So for example, we were all sort of sold a narrative that the internet was supposed to sort of open things up, be this really empowering, decentralizing force, allow much more equal play of people being able to express themselves. But in the end, I think many people feel that the internet's ended up concentrating a huge amount of power in a very small number of platforms that many of us don't really trust. Many of us, heard a narrative that bringing democracy to a place like Myanmar, freeing Aung San Suu Kyi, et cetera, was going to solve many of the problems of that country. And that didn't work out so great for a substantial minority of the people living there. We were told that if you auctioned off the radio spectrum in the United States, that this would allow the best use to be made of all of the bands of that spectrum. But in the end, what we've actually gotten is a huge number of over-the-air broadcasters who are holding on to little chunks of the spectrum, and then a few telecommunications companies that have bought up huge swaths of it, dominate it all, and don't provide very good service with it. We were told that globalization and technological development would be a rising tide that would lift all boats. But it didn't turn out so well for many of the middle classes within wealthy countries especially, and we've seen political reactions on the extreme right and left that are arguably traceable to some of those disappointments. Now, why? Well, I actually don't think the answer is too hard to find. Actually, the answer is not particularly new. It comes from some basic properties of social life that have been observed really at least since the early 19th century, but that are not really taken into account in the way that basic capitalistic and standard democratic institutions are set up. So one basic feature of social life is that we can all achieve more together than we can each individually. Some people call this network effects, some people call it increasing returns, economies of scale. There's lots of different names for this basic idea. But we actually know from basic economic theory that standard capitalistic markets just don't work very well in that circumstance. There's a whole bunch of results about that. And given that we all live in a civilization, we live in these big cities, we're connected by networks, that must be most of what's going on. Otherwise we would all be separately in the woods on our own. And yet we have this sort of capitalist imagination of how we organize our society, even though we sort of know that can't be really right for the world in which we actually live. We have this one person, one vote majoritarian vision of democracy, even though we know that there's a natural tendency of one person, one vote majoritarian democracy to systematically oppress minority groups within a society. We have this sort of vision of competitive markets as being sort of the usual way in which economies are governed, when in fact we know that most things that we actually buy and sell, houses or cars or whatever, most of the really valuable stuff is not just interchangeable commodities, but unique assets which will just not create a competitive market. And we act as if, sort of freeing people from formal slavery or things like this is sufficient to liberate them from the domination of capital, when in fact we can see in the statistics that wealth is incredibly concentrated, and that therefore there's sort of no reason to think that we would have labor and capital on symmetric terms in an open market. Okay, so there are big problems with this standard liberal vision. However, just complaining about it is really problematic. Why? Because it creates a vacuum. It says, okay, things have really gone wrong. And who steps in to fill that vacuum? Well, you get, on the one hand, a number of visions on the far right by people like Steve Bannon, Julius Krein, the founder of American Affairs, Curtis Yarvin, very interesting, disturbing figure, very influential on Peter Thiel, neo-reactionary. And on the other hand, you get a growing movement on the left, which sort of wants to put everything in the hands of like a single democratically elected state, have them sort of nationalize large parts of the economy and run it in some centrally directed way. Both of these paths, even though they're gaining huge amounts of political momentum, I don't think actually offer really an alternative to the problems that we're facing. They further concentrate power in precisely the way in which people are worried about power being concentrated. However, I do think there's an alternative, and I actually think it has a deep philosophical tradition. People like Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, Henry George, Beatrice Webb, the founder of much of the modern trade union movement in the UK, Hannah Arendt, and William Vickery, who I've been particularly influenced with, had a vision of trying to set up a society that overcame some of these fundamental problems, that tried to, in a world that is fundamentally social, fundamentally increasing returns to scale, where things are not commodities, with the complexities that our world has, nonetheless preserves sustainable, liberal, decentralized institutions. Now, a challenge that they faced was that, unlike capitalism, unlike one person, one vote, which are these simple, sloganable, formal institutions that people can get, the attempts that they had made to describe and define these things were substantially more complicated. They ended up looking like really messy things like the New Deal or the social democratic state in Europe, or the way the Scandinavians, things that you can't even really explain very clearly, unlike these things like capitalism and democracy. And to a large extent, what we're trying to do in this project is to take those ideas, things that I would call liberal radicalism, and that's actually a historical name for some of these ideas, and formalize them into institutions that can be sort of written into code or into constitutions and sort of broadly apprehended by the public. Okay, so that vision really starts from a foundation in the way we think about ourselves as individuals. Like, what is it that makes us unique individuals? So one vision of that, something that you hear from people often who call themselves liberals, and that's not just people who are on the left liberals, as we understand in the US, but also libertarians, is that the greatest expression of what it means to be an individual is when we're able to be completely independent and autonomous. So you actually hear references from a lot of liberals to the idea of suicide as an ultimate expression of individuality, the ability to choose the moment of your death. So the Stoics, philosophers, had a huge emphasis on this notion that that's really the greatest expression of individuality, is if you can choose the moment of your death. Or more recently, from people who are, say, advocates of universal basic income, you hear about the surfer as sort of the image of someone who just leaves civilization, goes out on their own. They have the freedom to do that. That's the expression of an individual. But when I hear about someone who's committing suicide or a surfer, I don't think of that as a unique individual. I actually think of that as kind of a stereotype. It's actually, there's nothing really surprising or interesting at all about that. It's like a total archetype within our society. Now, when I think of a unique or interesting individual, what I think instead of is a couple of friends of mine. So this guy is Amichai Lau-Lavie. He is the nephew of the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbi of Israel, and yet he's gay and runs a God-optional pop-up experimental synagogue named Lab Shul that I attend in New York City. And he was ordained in the conservative denomination of the Jewish faith, but was kicked out for writing a 300-page dissertation using Jewish law to argue why you should be able to marry a Jew and a non-Jew, which he went on to do. Here's another person, someone actually involved with the radical exchange movement that I'll tell you about in a bit. Her name is Mona Hamdi. She was raised in Egypt. She worked for the Saudi Arabian government for many years. She is the mother of 3 in her 30s, a major socialite in Washington, D.C., owns 6 of the 10 highest-rated restaurants in the city, and is doing a PhD in applied ethics at the Divinity School at Harvard. So I think most people would have the reaction, wow, those sound like really unique, interesting people. But one thing you'll note is that every word I use to describe them would be meaningless absent a social context. None of it would be meaningful, being a surfer, being out on your own, being in the middle of the wilderness. All of it is about the incredibly unusual pattern of social identifications and social commitments that each of these people has. And I think that that is the essence of what it is that makes us individuals. This is actually a theory from a sociologist, Georg Simmel, that what defines us as individuals is the intersection of the social commitments that we are a part of. And the fact that that pattern is unique is what strikes us out as individuals and unique. Now, that is something which sounds airy-fairy. It's a part of the liberal radical vision of the world, I think. But increasingly, modern technology gives us the power to actually formalize this. So how do we formalize identity in the contemporary world? Well, it used to be that we thought of people as identified by the community that they were a part of. And then within that community, they were defined by a place in which they lived and their relationship to other people in that community. In fact, modern names are very recent, only a few hundred years old. It used to be people were actually defined by the way in which they related to the people within their community, and names would come from that. But then the nation state came along and it said, no, you're going to have an ID. And your ID is going to have these few facts about you that everyone is going to be flattened into those few facts about them. And all the relationships of the communities that used to define their identity is going to be wiped away, so we can have people's ability to travel to cities and move around the country so they're not stuck in that community. So in some ways that was liberating, but it also flattened all the complexity that people had, and it placed in this single central authority the ability for them to access all the things that they have within their world and to find anyone who is unable to get that authorization out. Now, a lot of people in the recent tech world have been saying, no, instead let's have a vision where people control their own identity, where you own all your own data. You have some cryptographic key or something like that. It has access to all of the data about you, and you can choose who you're going to share that with. You can choose who has access to that. The trouble with that is that almost all the information about us is not information just about us. My mother's date of birth is also my mother's date of birth. And it's my sister's mother's date of birth. And it's my grandmother's date of the birth of her first child, etc., etc. And so this notion of these information about us belonging to us ourselves doesn't really make any sense. Instead, we need to think about our identity as being a crossroads of all of the communities that we're a part of. And there are actually formal protocols for identity verification, alternatives to having an ID, alternatives to signing into something on Facebook that draw on precisely this structure. And I've been working on this with Matt Jackson, who's an economist at Stanford, and a computer scientist, Nicole Imorlika, at Microsoft. I won't go into all the details of how it works, but the notion is very similar to what we do in everyday life. When we want to make sure of something about someone else, we don't usually go to the government to ask. We ask a friend who knows them. And we can build that sort of a protocol directly into the structures of the way that computers work, so that all the data doesn't need to be controlled by someone like Facebook or Google, but can actually work through the relations that we have to people and the way that we vouch for various things about others in our lives. Now, another aspect of this, moving beyond the level of the individual, abstracting to a broader society, is that if we're all made up of the communities that we're a part of, in order for individuals to flourish, the crucial thing is allowing for the freedom for new dynamic communities to evolve and to form and to shape people's lives. Because if what freedom to define yourself as an individual is really freedom to be part of a new and diverse and emergent sets of communities, that is what we have to focus on creating as a society. And that's what people often call civil society or networks. And it's been a focus of a lot of liberal, radical, political theory for hundreds of years. But the problem is the standard liberal institutions don't actually do a good job representing this. On the one hand, capitalism and private property give people incentives to be selfish, to hoard things to themselves, and to undermine community. And they lead to the decay of infrastructure and to this sense of isolation that people have. They underprovide the public goods that we all depend on as communities. On the other hand, if we think about democracies, standard one-person, one-vote democracies within some fixed geographic boundary, they lead to the domination of the majority within that group over minorities. And often to a lot of unreflective sort of mob rule type dynamics where, a group of people can, without much thought, get something into their head and really oppress the rest of the people. So together with Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, which is the largest blockchain platform, and a poet, philosopher, economist, PhD student at Harvard, Zoe Hitzig, we propose a new structure for social organizations to form that's an alternative both to corporations and to states, which is based on sort of the dynamism that entrepreneurship brings to forming new organizations and the democratic internal governance that nation states have. How does that work? Well, one simple entry point into it is to think about campaign finance. So in the city of New York, if you give up to $175 to a candidate who has at least 999 other people giving money to them, you get a 6-for-1 match to that contribution. Now, what's the idea of that? Well, on the one hand, we want to allow citizens to say, I really support this candidate. So you want somehow money or some sort of commitment to play a role. On the other hand, you know that people who are just a small drop in the bucket aren't going to have much incentive to contribute. So you want to match those small contributions more than big contributions. Okay, but then you might ask, well, why 6-for-1? Why up to $175? All that sounds really arbitrary, right? So the question is, how can we make that less arbitrary? And it turns out that there's a formula that you can derive that gives sort of optimal incentives for this sort of thing, which is that rather than the amount being received by a charity or a candidate being the sum of the amounts given, instead they should be the square of the sum of the square roots given. Now that sounds really magical and mysterious. It turns out it corresponds to a very simple principle that I think we all intuitively would agree with, which is, if we all, when choosing to give to a charity, could choose to sort of tax everybody else who's involved rather than just give ourselves, many of us would give a lot more than we do, right? If we knew everybody else would sort of match us along with it. Turns out that this can be derived from the notion that everybody else should, in proportion to how important the thing is to them, match the amount more that you contribute. That's how you derive this idea. Now that requires subsidies, because obviously you're going to get your contribution scaled up. Where does that extra money come from? Where does that matching funds come from? Well, in the near term, where it's coming from in practice, this system is actually being applied in several places, is from either philanthropists or from some administrator who's running some system and trying to fund goods within that ecosystem. So open source software development, platforms that are making money off of some open source software ecosystem can use that money that they're making to match these individual contributions to fund open source software projects. Okay, so that can be used to create these new types of communities. And these new types of communities then have to be governed somehow. And for that, we propose this system called Quadratic Voting, which I think I won't go into too much in the interest of time, but it's basically related to this. It's the idea that every participant receives some number of credits that they can spend on different issues. So rather than you having one person, one vote, so the majority oppresses the minority, instead, each citizen can choose the issues and the candidates that are most important to, or that they're most opposed to spend their votes on. But the more votes they put on an issue, the more expensive it gets to have more influence on that, so that you won't be an extremist and just dump all your support onto one issue. And that's the quadratic component. Turns out that this gives everyone an incentive to buy votes in proportion to how important they are to them. So that rather than issues being determined just by the majority, they get determined by sort of the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, if instead of having these internally democratically governed organizations that emerge from this sort of democratic but expressive process, you put private property in charge of these networks, in charge of these economies of scale, inevitably what you end up getting is monopolies. And that's what we see all over our society. Now, in the near term, the best thing to do about these monopolies is to try to restrain their power. And there are lots of ways in which we can do that in the near term. And these things are already starting to happen. So there are huge monopolies that are created by our current antitrust policies that completely ignore the largest sources of monopoly power. What are those? Well, first of all, there's a few institutional investors, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, that control about a quarter of the whole corporate economy. And they own American Airlines and United. They own CVS and Walgreens. They have no interest in seeing these compete against each other for workers or for consumers. And because they control so much, they've been systematically raising prices, lowering wages, and controlling our political process. Antitrust could do something about this. It's done nothing about it because the public isn't clued into it. They don't realize these systemic things going on in the background. It sounds like an esoteric finance issue, just like all the stuff before the financial crisis did. But it's having a huge effect on people's living standards. Another huge issue is antitrust authorities completely ignore the power that companies have over workers. They think about power over consumers. But anyone who's ever worked a job knows that companies have way more power over the people they employ than the people that they sell sparkling water to. And that's been, again, ignored by antitrust authorities. We also need to restrain the power of these monopolists by building up things like unions, things that give us power against the monopolists, collective organizations of citizens. And we argue that the best way to protect our data and the value that's being taken from us by the big tech platforms who are making all this money off the data that we're contributing every day is for us to form data labor unions and other organizations that can bargain collectively to return that value to us as citizens. And in fact, interestingly, Governor Newsom has come around to this view, and in his State of the State address last week actually proposed a very closely related idea. But eventually, we think we need to move more radically beyond the capitalist institutions that lead to all of these monopolies, by moving beyond simple private property, by turning what is currently private property into something more like an auction, where the assets that are owned by large companies are allocated by sort of a competitive process, but where the proceeds of that auction are continually returned to the public. And anyone can at any time outbid those companies for control of those assets. And the particular way in which that would work would be that companies would self-assess the value of assets like spectrum or intellectual property, pay a tax on that self-assessed value, but have to stand ready to sell the asset for that price, which would ensure that assets flow much more freely to their best use, that spectrum doesn't get gummed up in a few places, but at the same time that much of the value of it is returned to the broader society rather than being concentrated in the hand of a few capitalists. Okay, so that sounds like a pretty bold set of ideas, fundamentally rethinking property, fundamentally rethinking how we fund all of our institutions, and it is. It started as a book, but as I went around the world talking about this, there was this outpouring of interest, outpouring of desire to see our institutions change in these sorts of ways. So the book ended up getting listed as one of the we were listed, me and my co-author, as one of the 50 most influential people of 2018 by Bloomberg Businessweek. by Wired as one of the 25 people shaping the next 25 years of technology, one of the Economist's best books of the years. At the same time, there was a huge amount of startup activity around this. So there's something like 100 startups and corporate projects that have formed around these ideas. And it led to me being one of the 6 most influential people in the blockchain in 2018. And they made this little cartoon figure of me. Well, there's this whole weird thing in the blockchain. But as you can see, it has a pencil as its weapon. So very effective fighter. We've been working with governments all around the world on this, on changing antitrust policies in Europe. So this is with an antitrust official in Europe. This is me in the European Parliament with the founders of a data labor union. Here in California, there's these issues around data unions and so forth, and talking to all sorts of people in the public. And luckily, quickly, this got well beyond me or anything that I could manage. And it's emerged into this social movement called the Radical Exchange Movement, which has, as I mentioned, elements of combining activism, art, ideas, entrepreneurship, and so forth. And it's only through all those things together that I think we can make real social change. So it does go way beyond economics or computer science or anything like that. So actually our head of ideas and research is not an economist or a computer scientist or a political scientist. It's a post-colonial historian named Ananya Chakravarty at Georgetown University. There's all these entrepreneurial projects. This is a sentiment analysis of the Ethereum blockchain, which is the largest flexible blockchain platform. This shows the exponential growth of discussion about these ideas towards the end of 2018 in teal there. There's all sorts of art being produced around this, science fiction, virtual reality simulations, board games, etc. This isn't working, but this is a video of people singing a song about this at the largest blockchain conference. And there have been about 100 local clubs that have started up all around the world around these ideas. And we're convening this all in March as a conference in Detroit, March 22nd to 24th. I hope some of you will consider coming, but also we have local groups all around the world. So if you're interested in getting involved, either through the university, we have lots of student groups, and we have community groups. There's not one in San Diego yet, so that's a great opportunity if it interests anyone. Feel free to write me at glenn@radicalexchange.org. And amazingly, it's translating into actual action. So this is Jen Marone. She's the head of our arts and communications track. She's a wonderful artist doing stuff about data slavery. And she's been giving talks about this. There's chapters in Singapore, in Latin America, in London. Here's a version of Monopoly based on the ideas in the book. There's an academic symposium at the University of Chicago with a dozen papers about this stuff. This is an example based on that square of the sum of the square roots formula. There was a bunch of grants given out for open source software development. And this is Margrethe Vestager, probably my favorite politician today, who is likely to be the next head of the European Commission, who is the competition commissioner, deciding that they're going to bring action against institutional investors last month. So anyways, that's a lot to take in 30 minutes. I probably over time as well. I'm really looking forward to the comments, and I hope I can engage some of you in being involved in changing some of these fundamental problems we're facing. Thanks.
So I guess I'll kick it off. First, making sure you can all hear me. So I am Professor Renee Bowen from the School of Global Policy and Strategy. I want to thank John very much for inviting me to comment on this wonderful book. Glenn, thanks for coming. This has been a really eye-opening experience for me. As John mentioned, I'm an economist. I study political economy. Glenn is also an economist, yet somehow...
Also a civil engineer.
I am also a civil engineer, so just a tiny bit about my background. I'm originally from Jamaica, which makes this a very interesting context for me. And I came at this economics thing simply from observing a lack of poor institutions in Jamaica, my home country. But I thought, well, we just need more roads. Shouldn't that fix it? So that's why I engaged in civil engineering at MIT. Of course, by the end of it, I discovered that, after some time in investment banking, JP Morgan, I discovered, well, it's really not that simple. Getting the roads there is really not what one might expect. And so I went off to study economics to figure out, why can't we get more roads? Of course, that led me into, why can't we get more trade? Why can't we get more of this? And hence I'm studying political economy. And the issues that Glen raised are very, very near and dear to my heart. So much so that I've started this year a Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, which really looks to address these institutional issues. Institutions have really gotten us to where we are over the last 75 years, speaking of international institutions. And they've really ushered in a long period of global growth. But as Glen identified, that set of institutions is very much under threat and very much being questioned. And the issue is, where to next? What do we do next? And so much of the center's work is trying to figure out, first, what do we know about existing institutions? And second, what are the right institutions going forward? And how can we make these institutions more sustainable? Obviously, one major feature of making these institutions sustainable is addressing exactly the issues that Glen is talking about, which is equity. A big issue now threatening the current system is simply the fact that not everyone is sharing the gains. There are gains, but not everyone's getting it. And so how do we address these issues of equity? So before I continue with that and some specific points on quadratic voting, which is really, what resonated with me given my work in political economy, and I'm also a theorist, as Glen is. I just also wanted to thank Glen's wife, Alicia Holland, for letting Glen tag along on her trip to UCSD. She's the one to be thanked. And I as I thought about it, I said, well, you've definitely solved the equity problem in your own marriage. So you have some credibility there.
And she's the expert on roads as well, as you found out today.
That's right. She gave a great talk. You should all certainly check out her work. So just to get a little bit more serious, although serious is not really what I do very well. But I will make an attempt on Glen's behalf. So as I mentioned, I'm really sympathetic to the ideas in this book. And Glen is an overwhelmingly smart individual and collaborating with some overwhelmingly smart people. And what I love is that he's really kicking off this discussion. There's a lot to be talked about. So the first thing I sort of want to raise is this idea that the voters, there's clearly something challenging about this one person, one vote thing. And in 2016, I published a paper with Cecilia Moe, who's now at Berkeley Political Science. And the title of the paper was The Voter's Blunt Tool. And the essential observation is that's all you've got, one vote. You either do or you don't. You can't tailor this vote very precisely to get exactly the policies you want or to express exactly the intensity of how much you want a particular policy. But there we sort of emphasize the limitation of that vote versus special interests. So special interests can also influence policy, as Glen somewhat alludes to. But they have the ability to tailor their funds, and we think about these schedules of contributions, and it's essentially an auction for policies, right? these special interests can tailor their bids to these policies and say, okay, I'll give you X dollars for this trade policy. I'll give you Y dollars for some other trade policy. Whereas voters can only say, you give me free trade, I don't vote for you. Or you give me free trade, I vote for you. That's all they get, right? So that creates a massive imbalance between those who can do this very specific tailoring versus voters. But so as I reflected on Glen's work, indeed, quadratic voting does address some of this tyranny of the majority, and that's something worth noting. Yet my view is it's perhaps more the tyranny of the minority, which I understand is the cost is intended to address. So with quadratic voting, I sympathize with addressing the tyranny of the majority, but I really would be more interested in what do we do about those special interests who are more acting against the interests of voters. So that's point one. So the second point is in the book, Glen mentions the extension of the voting franchise in the 19th century in the West. And it's sort of presented, correct me if I'm wrong, as almost a triumph of the left, the leftist movement. And while that might be the case, you can absolutely correct me if I'm wrong. While that might be the case, I really wanted to sort of go back to some work by Darona Acemoglu and Robinson in 2000, where they put forward a different view of why the West extended the franchise. And that view is essentially elites in the West recognized that either they extend the voting franchise or there was a much bloodier and more destructive way in which redistribution was going to occur. So they reasoned, looking a few steps ahead, that we extend the voting franchise and avoid this bloody coup. We get to retain a lot of our power, but maybe we have to give up something, right? And so two things here. One is that this requires a dynamic view of things. So quadratic voting doesn't quite get at that dynamic view or other ideas in this book. But really, we need to take this long run view. And my essential opinion of what is really at issue here with institutions is elites, both on the left and on the right, being completely ignorant of what is going on with the majority. And if they were to really wake up, and what they should be realizing is that if they wish to avoid bloody coup, as those elites, they should take a cue from the elites in the 19th century, they need to start thinking very hard about redistribution. Right? I say they, but in some sense I should include myself. I have a reasonable job. I'm getting a good income. I have a nice house. And we all want to think of elites as them. But if you're sitting here in this audience, quite likely you are a member of the elite. Right? And what we need to be thinking about is how do we enact this redistribution to avoid these bloody coups? And this is redistribution domestically and globally. How do we include other countries? And so my final point, I don't know how much time I have left. I have other points. I have many other points, but I'll mention one other thing. Indeed, quadratic voting does have this benefit of restoring rights to minorities, but there are other systems that do also. So Alessandra Casella has a very nice idea about storable votes. And in a recent paper, she actually looks at storable votes versus quadratic voting. You probably know about this paper. In an experiment. And she proves that, yes, indeed, they both have nice properties. So herself and her co-author put forward that storable votes will essentially not allow minorities, or less frequently allow minorities to get outcomes that really harm aggregate welfare. right? So the idea of storable votes and quadratic voting is to give back power to minorities, but occasionally that goes awry, and minorities get their will at the vast expense of everyone else. And that happens quite frequently with quadratic voting, according to Alessandra's paper. I'll let Glenn respond to that.
But she actually finds quadratic voting does better overall, though she does find that,
Well, so
that's her own finding. Her own finding.
I'm not going to debate her paper. I'm just going to say there are other systems out there. What I like about storable votes is that it is simpler. So just a small comment on quadratic voting and the cost. As you probably know, it is complex. And where complexity is involved, information becomes really important. And whenever there's complexity and asymmetry of information, there's the opportunity for distortion, there's the opportunity for inefficiency, and for rents to be created. So that's my only caution. This is a great discussion, and I'm really, really happy to be a part of it. Thanks.
How do I follow acts like that? I'm David Brin. A lot of you in the audience know me. I'm your local loco, and also science fiction author. But I did my doctorate here, about 600 yards from here, in astrophysics. And I have a book called The Transparent Society that may come up in my 5 minutes. All right. Well, first of all, science fiction was poorly named. Only 10% of science fiction authors are scientifically trained, as I am. And it doesn't feature in the plot outline as often as you might think. What really almost all science fiction authors have imbued themselves in all their lives is reading history. And it should have been called speculative history. Think about it. It's about extending the greatest story of all, the horrible litany of errors called human history, into a future, speculated future, or speculated parallel worlds. So, when Renee was talking about redistribution, she was referring to the smart end of the aristocracy, which we are now counting on to step in to save us. Certainly the three richest people in America, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and Jeff Bezos, are all Democrats and all want their taxes raised for the same reason that she was talking about, and that is what Joe Kennedy is reputed to have said when he was called a traitor to his class by supporting FDR. And let me give props to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because she's the only person mentioning him. When the proper polemic to be using, that the Democrats should be using right now, is socialism. The greatest generation loved FDR. And you're not going to get the Trump voters to say anything bad about the greatest generation. But there was another example, and that is right after the revolution, the founding parents seized up to a third of the land in all of the colonies and redistributed it. It was the greatest mass redistribution to the populace. Now, granted, the populace was defined as free, white, landowning, or literate males. But it was a step. And it was a very substantial.
We keep making steps.
It was
baby steps.
The point is, it was historically a very aggressive step that neutralizes those who would demean redistribution in principle, as opposed to the pragmatic argument against redistribution, and that is that it destroys competitive enterprise. Now, liberalism, I agree that we're oversimplifying, and liberalism to me is less about the division. That's more a tool, the division of power into a dispersed polity, than it is to get past the fundamental human calamity, and that is that we're all subjectively delusional. You're delusional, you're delusional, you're delusional. You all get a delusion. Reach under your chair. And when you have a pyramidal social structure ruled by a narrow oligarchy, which was 99% of all of our ancestors lived under these for 6,000 years, you're going to get ruled by deluded jerks. And I have just explained human history. The one way in which we found an antidote to this plague of delusion is that your delusion isn't the same as hers or hers or hers or his. And so they will happily point out yours, and you will happily point out theirs. It's called reciprocal accountability or criticism, and we hate it. We love dishing it out. We hate receiving it. But the point is that institutionalizing reciprocal accountability and criticism was the great Enlightenment innovation. And the other ones that are credited to the Enlightenment are methods by which we get this valuable error detection system. Democracy, rights. These are all methods by which we can, freedom of speech, get the reciprocal criticism, which is the lifeblood of the fact that we have accomplished more in the last 150 years than in the entire history of our species. And we did this through 5 arenas: democracy, science, markets, justice courts, and sports. And why do I mention sports? Because sports is the metaphor that really brings it home that it is regulated competition. On the left, they hate the word competition, and it's a stupid mistake since liberalism was founded in leveraging human competition to solving problems. The right despises regulation, when in fact it was only regulated competition that gives you your sporting leagues. Imagine a sporting league that took away all the rules, including the rules against murder. One Saturday, it's over. So that's the metaphor. The 5th arena is the metaphor that gets people to understand why these 5 arenas absolutely depend on the thing that I push, and that is transparency. Because you can't have reciprocal competitive accountability if participants don't know what's going on. They have to have rights, but it goes beyond that. They have to see what's going on. And the thing that the Putinists have been doing to us lately is destroying our ability to deal in fact. And this is the issue that it enrages me that the Democrats aren't making this their core issue, because all other things that are on their agenda, including democratic socialism or Green New Deal and all that, should rise or fall based on their merits. But they cannot rise and fall based on their merits if fact is messed up. Now, I'm going to try to race through a couple more things. I disagree that majorities must oppress. Generally, that's true. It's depicted in my friend Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. That is not an Orwellian dystopia. It is a majoritarian dystopia. And people don't realize this. Kurt Vonnegut's wonderful novella, Harrison Bergeron, a fear of demarchy, of oppression by a homogenizing majority is valid. And it's a valid complaint about my assertion in the Transparent Society, which, if we had universal transparency, we might be safe from Big Brother forever. But what about a 51% little brothers that oppress us? And was illustrated in Black Mirror not long ago. And this is what China is relying upon in their social credit system that they're instituting. But it's not what happens here. And the reason is 3 generations of Hollywood. The fundamental message, meme pushed by Hollywood and by science fiction, is suspicion of authority. Now, this has metastasized, and Putin's using it against us. But the fundamental meme of suspicion of authority means appreciation of eccentricity. And if you look at the memes in almost all Hollywood films, the fundamental is that the worst person is the person who pushes conformity and quashes eccentricity. Now, this could be fragile, but it happens to be the dominant meme now, and we need to appreciate that it is so. So, all right, Orwellianism is our main fear. the difference between someone on the left and someone sincere on the right is which direction they think is trying to become Big Brother. Snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats? No, it's conniving aristocrats and faceless corporations. It happens that I agree with one more than the other right now, but we need to recognize that we share the fundamental fear, and it's being used against us, it's being used to divide us now. But I wanted to just mention a couple of other things. Let's say we use transparency, as I mentioned, to prevent Big Brother, which the prescription of all European freedom activists is we must paternalistically close down information flows to protect people's information. So they have the right instinct and the absolutely wrong prescription, and it's 100%. If you're from Europe, you will prescribe that, whereas a certain large fraction of our wonderful heroes, ACLU, EFF, of freedom, and a certain fraction of them also prescribe that. But some of them get the notion that we will never blind elites. It's impossible. It's a stupid idea. But we can strip them naked. We have 150 years of experience doing that. But let's say we do that and we end Orwellian fears, then we have the problem of the 51%. Then we have the problem that if everybody's naked, people might simply vote to oppress you. And so we have that. That's taking shape in China right now, in many places around the world, and that's a problem. Now, I want to quickly turn to you guys and ask, first off, quick answer. Is preferential voting a step toward your historical or your quadratic voting? Is it at least a step in that direction?
Quick answer, I have no idea.
Well, we're seeing preferential voting
so what I would
appearing in New England now. People seem to almost be ready for it.
So I think it's a positive thing. I think approval voting is even better, probably. But if you had a spectrum from like, here's where we are, here's like, the quadratic voting world I imagine, I'd say preferential voting is here, approval voting is here, and it's over here. But I do think it's a good step.
Good.
So
I got good,
yeah.
concise answers to that. Preferential voting, by the way, is how we in science fiction have been allocating the Hugo Awards now for 40 years. But New England is catching up, and that is the notion that you vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the 5 candidates, and that way, the one you hated the most, the people hated the most, won't get in. Whereas our current system almost guarantees that a Ralph Nader can give you a George Bush.
So there was actually a little poll done on this with intensity of preference. The most disliked candidate in the previous election, like on net, was Trump. Second most was Hillary. Most liked on net was Kasich, and second was Sanders. So, go figure.
Yes, but I think people in this audience could have lived with a simple one-step cutoff on that. I want to ask you. I proposed, and a federal judge gave his opinion to me, private opinion, that he thought it could work, a simple solution to gerrymandering, and that is the Supreme Court has been reluctant to end gerrymandering. One of its excuses, its rationalizations, has been that they don't want to interfere in the sovereignty of legislators. My proposal is minimal overlap. You allow the state assembly to gerrymander all it wants. But the other two houses, the state Senate and the Congress, have to be minimally overlap district. They have to be orthogonal in almost every way. So that if you gerrymander one house, you almost guaranteed to fail in the other two.
So I don't know if that's the right solution to gerrymandering, but I really like the idea for other reasons, which is that I think it achieves many of the goals of checks and balances in a really good way. And I think in general, the notion of having minimally overlapping different groups within a society and creating checks and balances that way is a really good one.
So let me give a defense for sovereignty. And so there's one thing I sort of really buy into is institutions, and there's something about the institutions that have worked. They're not perfect, and tinkering too much with existing institutions is not something to be done lightly. That's my.
Oh, you're talking Mr. Drastic Surgery Cyborg changing our.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in things bubbling up from the bottom and experiments and so forth, and that's very much what we're working on.
Well, yes, but my last question for you is that your cost system, which didn't come up very much here, proposes to alter the fundamental notion of ownership, and that is that you state what you own is worth, and then you're taxed 7% of that. If you state it too low, then someone can just simply buy it off you for that price. If you state it too high, then you get a lot of taxes. Now, at the first level, it sounds kind of cool. I'd like to take a poll. How many think that you could implement that and actually make it work?
Cargo ships,
yeah,
trade ships passing through
in Denmark in the 16th century. Yeah.
So this sounds like an industry with a lot of information and a lot of incentives to get it right. Now, what happens when someone is in their tiny house, just minding their own business, and how are they to know exactly the right value?
That's definitely why we shouldn't start with that. I mean, that's why we advocate in the book starting with things like Spectrum, which are owned by large corporations, intellectual property, et cetera, and we'll learn, and things will grow up from there. The one thing I just wanted to say is thank you both, and in particular, we want collaboration. We desperately want collaboration from folks like you. Help improve these designs. If you have thoughts for improving the designs, if you think you can do better. That's what we want. And we need artists to help us imagine these worlds and the problems that will arise in them, just as you described. So more than anything, more than any event, I want you guys to be part of the project and to contribute and evolve these things. We're starting publishing platforms. We have this conference. We have so many different ways to be engaged. So I hope we can have your collaboration.
That's terrific, and you've been most patient with us, especially with me. Should we open things up?
Yeah, I was going to say, so Glenn, if there's any responses you want to make, I was going to ask people to. That's the extent of my. So if you want to make something, like, raise your hand, please, and then I'll try to come and get a mic to you. But if I cannot, then I will ask that you speak loudly so that the entire room can hear you. Yes, in the back.
I'm from the League of Women Voters, so this is particularly interesting to me. We might be the only national organization that strategically educates voters on their ballot. We're completely nonpartisan. We never talk about candidates. We do those kind of forums, but we don't take positions on candidates. However, we do educate voters. And so the Citizens Initiative, our ballots are enormous.
No.
And so some of these events where we just literally go through the ballot and tell the people the pros and the cons and what the financial implications are, et cetera, can take up to 2 hours. And invariably, the criticism is, why am I asked to vote about this? Like, we have representative democracy. Why can't I just trust my representative to do what's right for me? And so I get a lot of pushback from voters because it's too much information. You know, they can't digest it. So can you just speak to how your situation would solve that? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of that. Hannah Arendt, one of the people I mentioned, has a wonderful phrase where she says, one of the greatest inventions of the modern world is freedom from politics. And I think that that's right. And I think quadratic voting is in many ways an attempt to actualize that notion. So the idea is that everyone would have the freedom to weigh in on things if they know and care to weigh in on them, and to weigh in much less on them if they don't know or care to weigh in on those particular issues. And we've, I can show the interface. I probably shouldn't use the time, but if someone wants to see it afterwards, I'm happy to show it to you. But, you know, quadratic sounds complex. It sounds quadratic equation. We have an interface which couldn't be easier. We've done it with 5,000 people, about a third of which didn't finish high school. And we get consistent alignment with a whole bunch of different axes that are indicative of whether they would care or what they would care about and so forth. My wife has actually done it with a largely illiterate population in Colombia. It's actually something that, with the right interface, is very intuitive for people to use. And unlike one person, one vote, it gives you the freedom to be knowledgeable about the things you're knowledgeable about, to weigh in on the things you want to weigh in about, and not on others. You know, that's the way that the market works for professions. You specialize in some things, you're not an expert on others. We should give people the freedom to do that in politics as well.
Would you allow people to a limited degree, transfer their votes to someone who they think is more qualified in a particular subject?
I think that's something that's called liquid democracy. That's something I'm very sympathetic to. I haven't found the right ways to incorporate that together with quadratic voting, but that's exactly the sort of design issue. So I actually have a list of 150 design questions that I'm desperate for people to try to solve, because all these startups need answers to those questions.
Well, we already do it to an extent by simply asking our friends, what should I do?
Absolutely. So that is the sort of thing that I would love to have incorporated into these types of systems.
My name is Jamal Russell Black. I went to GPS a few years ago, graduated in 2016. Now I work for doing labor statistics over at San Diego Workforce Partnership. So my question is actually still in regard to the quadratic voting. Professor, you raised this point about the I guess asymmetry of information, and also the sorry, one second. The tyranny of the minority. So my concern is that if we have just basically one or a set of credits, maybe from 10 credits or so, and we can allocate those depending on what we want, what is most important to us, that the more popular or even sexy topics, border wall, yes or no, universal health care, yes or no, those are the ones that are going to be getting and receiving most of the credits, whereas topics such as anti-trade, or antitrust, things like data privacy, those topics may not actually get as many votes, which would then allow a certain subset of minority voters to effectively have a disproportionate amount of effect on our daily lives. So my question would be, how do we, I guess, deal with that?
I think that's a great point. One thing I would highlight, though, is that in our present system, things are rigged about as extremely in that direction as you could possibly get, because effectively all those technocratic issues end up getting dealt with by effectively lobbyists, because they have no transparency to the public. Now, there's a really great set of studies that were done in the field of political economy about the fact that on almost every issue, there's something that's called, and in almost every demographic group, there's something that's called an issue public. So this is like a minority of people within that group who are actually knowledgeable about that issue. And even, poor people in the inner city, there's like a small minority of them who actually know a lot about data privacy issues. And the problem is that other people from their same class group vote in ways that are pretty random on those issues, whereas that small minority votes in very systematic ways that are aligned with what you would think that their class interests are on those issues. And they're also knowledgeable, and all of the things line up with thinking these people actually know what they're doing, and the other people from their group are just sort of noise and are actually drowning the influence of that group because they're not asking their friends about it. So if we build systems that, whether it's directly by liquid democracy or whether it's by quadratic voting or these things, that give more opportunity for those who really have something to say it, and not just for the lobbyists to say it, I think on net you're going to shift the system towards one where you get much more say for a broader set of emergent publics. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to address the special interest issue. Absolutely we do. That's why I talk about campaign finance. And I think this system of campaign finance that I was talking about would really shift the playing field a huge amount. because what it would do is effectively make a bunch of things that get lots of small contributions totally swamp things that get a few large contributions.
So this is a follow-up to this question and something I had as I read. How do we address the idea that special interests with the resources can in fact now sway these minority of voters? They can essentially buy their votes. And say, look, I only need 5 of you, store it up for this one issue, and I'll give you a pile of money.
Well, so I mean, obviously, in our present system, you could do that as well, but you have to reach possibly more people. But it's still the case in this system that there's a strong weight towards doing that for a larger number of people. And the reason why that's true is that it becomes quadratically more expensive. So to get 5 votes is 25. That additional vote over 4 costs you 9 additional credits. If you can get it over a large number of people, it's much more effective. Actually, the most effective thing is to go to the opponents and get them to spend just a little bit less, because they gain a huge amount by voting a little bit less in that direction. So I actually think it would shift the dynamics of that conversation in a way that reduces polarization, because you'd have this incentive to appeal to the people who are actually the extremists on the opposite side and try to bring them back to the center.
But in terms of sort of the coordination issue of getting that number of votes that you need, it becomes much easier, because really now you only need to rely on a smaller group of people versus a large swath of people. But I totally buy your point that it's probably cheaper in the end under the current system.
Well, I mean, the truth is we need a lot more study in game theoretic models when the public, I mean, we've only done a very limited amount of study on quadratic voting. The Casella paper is one example of that, but this is just beginning, and we'll gain insights from that, and that'll adjust the designs. And in fact, there's huge amounts of opportunities to experiment. There's about 50 or 60 large-scale experiments now going on in these companies, and we just need economists who want to study them and help design them and all that sort of stuff. So,
did you say Cthulhu paper?
Casella.
Oh, okay. There are people out there who get the joke.
I want to get to the audience. Go ahead, please.
Well, the one thing I wanted to mention is that now, as we're in phase 8 of the American Civil War, it's the polarization has meant that the Union side in this war has failed to understand the value of peeling off supporters from the other side. And that's what I thought of when I heard you talk about the incentivizing of the peeling off of those in the center. This whole notion of the pliable center has gained ill repute as we are encouraged to radicalize, when, of course, what one might call Confederate, because it's been the same since 1778, the side in this phase of our Civil War is highly vulnerable if they lose just another 2 million members of their coalition.
I hear, sir.
I'm one person, and I make my one vote. I say I'm one person, and I make my one vote for the candidate I like. And the candidate goes to Washington, or the same thing happens in the state or the city, and all of a sudden, the political party bosses tell my candidate how to vote, except when the vote becomes irrelevant or not meaningful. But if it's meaningful, he doesn't get to vote, or she doesn't get to vote. The problem then is the political party. You might as well just vote for the party. Now, what does that do to all your proposals as to democracy and voting? When the political party comes in here and distorts things, it makes the Constitution almost irrelevant.
So two things on that. So the first thing is there's a fascinating project from a guy I actually met yesterday called The Good Party. And I can't tell you all about it, but it's basically a really interesting idea where you basically have people sign a pledge that if there's enough people who are willing to vote for some candidate, then everyone will go and write in their name. And if that candidate gets elected, they're then pledged to basically follow the will of a democratic app type process where people who have voted for this person are weighing in on the issues. So I think that's a very interesting initiative. But the second thing is the reason why parties are so important in our present system is because of something that's very famous in political economy called Duverger's law, which basically says that like it's a wasted vote if you vote for Ralph Nader, and so like you've just got to vote for Hillary or Trump, right? And if there wasn't that dynamic, if there were actually a more flexible way for people to sort of get the best candidate to get to the top, then that wouldn't happen. And it turns out you can show in quadratic voting that doesn't happen because you basically have positive and negative votes on each candidate. And so if you hate Trump, you can just do that by hating Trump rather than voting up Clinton. And so that takes away this advantage from the two dominant parties and allows more people to bubble up, and it undermines the importance of that party system.
The preferential voting is starting to get some legs, and none of these others are. And that one certainly does let you vote Nader your first choice.
But by the way, it's definitely not true that quadratic voting isn't getting legs. Actually, the Taiwanese government is about to announce that they're going to be using it for some things. So, yeah.
All right.
I think we have time for one remaining question in the back, sir. Yes, yeah.
What are the institutions that need to be convinced or bypassed that are to make this quadratic voting happen? Who needs to be convinced? Who's keeping it from happening?
Well, so first of all, I don't believe in institutions that change suddenly from the top down. I believe in experiments that bubble up from the bottom. And I think that there are all sorts of entrepreneurial things, from these experiments in Taiwan to all sorts of startups doing a million different things that are expanding. And I think as people see how well those work, as things like the Good Party get off the ground and they use quadratic voting internally, we'll see how these things work. The flaws in them will be improved and fixed. And they'll come to gain legitimacy with the broader public. And when they come to gain legitimacy with the broader public, then the battle will have been won. So, you know, Hannah Arendt, I keep quoting her, but I love her work. She says that the French Revolution demanded bread, and they got bread. The American Revolution demanded legitimacy, and they got legitimacy. And I think that what we need is a movement that tries to build these different forms of legitimacy from the bottom up, the same way that the colonists, you know, did when they came to the New World, and then uses that local sense of legitimacy to then displace the institutions above them.
So just a point.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the bottom up, which I really sympathize with. Yeah. But spectrum auctions doesn't really sound like the bottom. That sounds very much like the top. But I say it sounds a bit as a jest, but who we're really trying to convince that this is going to be in their interest is voters, common people. The example that it works for spectrum auctions doesn't seem to resonate, and this is more a marketing thing for yourself, something to keep in mind.
I agree with that, but look, I don't really view spectrum auctions as I view it as an interesting test case. I don't really view the value of the spectrum auctions itself as like a central thing here. I think the thing is, you know, it's a relatively safe place to get some, like, you know, gains. And if you get some gains there, you'll bring around mostly some set of elites, you know, but it'll spread the legitimacy among those elites. It's not even close to like everything that we want to do. We want to try this for co-working spaces. That's much sexier. Actually, one of the sexiest examples of using the cost is for collaborative home. Have you ever seen these artworks, these collaborative artworks where you buy pixels, and you buy these pixels and then you can make them whatever you want? And
it's above my pay grade.
These are really cool. And the thing is that they turn into kind of chaos because it's all capitalism, so there end up being holdouts, and so like it's just like a mess. But if you had the cost system, then actually you could sort of redevelop areas of it in a systematic way, and I think you get a much cooler artwork. So that's something that's super vivid, where you just see capitalism not working and another system working visually. Those are the things I'm most excited about, not the spectrum stuff. But the spectrum stuff is great. It brings around a lot of policy elites. Policy elites are important. So I think all of this stuff needs to happen at the same time, and that's why we're building such a diverse movement. And I really hope you will both contribute to it.
Well, the gamers will make short work of this pixel art thing. But I had one last question for you two, and that is, I know that Renee does. You're from the benighted East Coast. Do you know about?
I don't know if I'll be able to get back there tomorrow. In fact,
do you know about how California changed its electoral system about what was it 6, 7, 8 years ago, and profoundly de-emphasized the political parties as far as primaries are concerned and all of that, and it had a highly weird effect.
Yeah,
and that was a whole lot of races in which you had 2 Democrats, some with 2 Republicans in the general election, and the result was a far more powerful Democratic Party. It made the state more partisan in the halls of power and yet more moderate, because a lot of people have been commenting on partisan rigidity declining, but the dominance by one party going up because of these reforms. Do you know anything about Renee? Did you?
The main thing I would say about that is that legislation is like the perfect example of like why the sort of game theoretic analysis that like Renee and I are into is so important, because like the outcome that ended up happening there, like the public was surprised by it, but like every game theorist who was interviewed about this like predicted precisely what was going to happen. It was actually shocking how well the predictions turned out. But the thing is, like, nobody wanted to pay attention to it. It sounded cool, and so people did it. So like I'm really into systems that rather than just sounding cool or sounding simple or something like that, the simplicity is important at a certain level. You don't want to allow elaborate designs, but systems that actually like there's a good game theoretic reason to think that they might turn out well, that's what I'm in favor of. And like the reasoning I gave to the gentleman there was not that quadratic voting eliminates parties. In fact, he couldn't even figure out that it had anything to do with parties. But there's actually a game theoretic analysis of why it would lead parties to be less important.
So with that, before we thank our panelists, I would like to acknowledge Patrick Coleman and the Arthur C. Clarke Center, as well as Yekta Mohammadi, who really did all the hard work in making the event happen tonight. So thank you all so much.
Patrick, raise your hand back there. And may I put a plug that you look up the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination and get on the mailing list. How many of you are on the mailing list? All right, the rest of you would benefit.
And I would love to thank Glenn and David and Renee. Thanks for a stimulating conversation, and thank you all for taking time to come and spend it with us.